everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
Wow, I'm so excited, you guys. I'm going to cut through our little jokes to begin with because we're talking about behavior analysis. We're talking about behavior analytic research. I was looking into some articles in this hot new field, as one of our guests had said, a sizzling field of kind of looking at emergent relations in equivalence-based instruction. So, Jackie, Diana, go. Tell me everything you know about this, because I know you've programmed lots of apps. You've done tons of things, right? You've done all this work. You've gotten through with your proprietary video editing.
When two stimuli love each other very, very much.
Wait a minute. You guys lied to me. You said you were experts in all this technology. What? Well, good thing I thought ahead. And we brought in some ringers. We brought in some special guests who know all about equivalence-based instruction and all about the technology, so much that they posted a tutorial about how to use all this technology to kind of push the research field forward. We are joined tonight by Dr. Bryan Blair and Dr. Lesley Shawler. Bryan and Lesley, thank you so much for joining us, because my co-hosts don't know anything about this stuff. So, whew.
Yeah. Hi, thanks for having us. Excited to be here.
For most of our listeners out there, when we talk about, say, stimulus equivalence, that's something that sounds very familiar. And we talk about online learning. That sounds even more familiar, I think, after the past year we've all had as to what that exactly is. But when we put the two together, we are looking at a really exciting technology that can speed up learning. And so I'm very, very happy to hear about all the ins and outs of the research that the two of you have been doing in this field. But before we get into kind of the articles we'll be discussing and more into exactly what emergent relations and equivalence-based instruction are, I would love it if the two of you took a moment to introduce yourselves to our listeners.
Sure. Well, I am Dr. Blair, as you mentioned. I am a full-time faculty member at Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York. I've hopped around a little bit in my professional career. I've worked in adult services and home-based service as well, worked in some public schools. So I've been around for a while, got my BCBA probably over 15 years ago by now. And I stumbled into a PhD program, as some people do later in life. And I was introduced to emergent learning and emergent responding in one of my PhD courses with Dr. Jonathan Tarbox, who, if you have not had a chance to have on your podcast, I highly recommend sending that invitation out. He really sort of inspired some interesting research questions, which we'll talk about. Actually, one of my dissertation was based on a research proposal that I submitted for his class. So a lot of it is, links back to, learning in an academic setting, but also seeing things in the clinical and applied settings that I felt could be maybe done a little bit more effectively or efficiently. And some of that goes all the way back to my days at the New England Center for Children, where we saw a lot of additional discrimination training and match to sample instruction and applications of stimulus equivalence, even though I may not even have known that it was equivalence at the time, or maybe even the instructors and trainers might not have known that that's what was happening. But it inspired a lot of interesting thinking over the last couple of years, which, like I said, led to some of my recent research.
And Lesley, please tell us about yourself.
Hi, yeah, my name's Dr. Lesley Shawler, and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Kennedy Krieger Institute and Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I'm currently doing research mostly focused on problem behavior and helping families and individuals with severe problem behavior. But my roots go back a little bit more, I guess, diversely in terms of my interest in verbal behavior. And I've had the great experience of being able to work with Dr. Kyle Miguel, both for my master's, but also he ended up being my doctoral advisor for my PhD program as well. So a lot of my interest in this area has stemmed from some of his work, both translational, but also his work in more applied settings with children with autism, looking at how we can use equivalence-based instruction to be a little bit more efficient when we're working with these individuals and how we can help promote quicker learning for these individuals. So I've definitely had some pretty diverse experiences, but I'm interested in continuing to expand, looking at how we can use equivalence, both in translational practices, but also how we can help to produce a little bit better emergent responding for individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities as well.
Excellent. So before we get into our in-depth discussion, let's make sure that all of our listeners know which articles we'll be talking about tonight. So we've got 3 that we'll be talking about in depth because, hey, we have the authors here. Wow, what a coincidence. And then 1 that you all shared that I think is a good summary. I'm sure we'll bring up some of the overall pieces of it, but not necessarily as in depth. I'll start with that one. So we'll be looking at Sidman Goes to College, a meta-analysis of equivalence-based instruction in higher education by Brodsky and Feenup from Perspectives in Behavioral Science 2018, an evaluation of the emergence of untrained academic and applied skills after instruction with video vignettes by Blair, Shawler, Albright, and Furman from the Analysis of Verbal Behavior. And that, I believe, is online at the moment, so probably 2021. Using equivalence-based instruction to teach the visual analysis of graphs by Blair, Tarbox, Albright, McDonald, Shawler, Russo, and Dorsey. And that's Behavioral Interventions 2019.
Which is the most cited article in 2020.
Was it really?
Way to go, Bryan.
Nice.
I got the email, the certificate.
You got a gold copy of the article put on your wall?
A little certificate, I think. I saw that through my inbox.
I was like, ooh, you guys are getting fancy.
Very cool. I mean, it's a cool article. We're going to talk about it. And developing and implementing emergent responding training systems with available and low-cost computer-based learning tools, some best practices, and a tutorial by Blair and Shawler from Behavior Analysis and Practice 2020. We will not, unfortunately, be reading Sidman Goes to College 2, Crisis on Campus, Electric Boogaloo. So that one didn't make the cut. Oh, well.
Darn it.
I know. So many shenanigans. So why don't we make sure that everyone out there who is like, stimulus equivalence, I got to draw a picture, which is me. And anyone who hasn't thought of how you could use stimulus equivalence in sort of, instructional method outside of sort of having to read the book maybe for their graduate programs. Why don't we do a little quick summary of what equivalence-based instruction entails?
I think it's helpful to just, get maybe some of the terminology out of the way really briefly. I think you all did a podcast not too long ago too on this. But yeah, it's when we think about stimulus control over responding, we think about things like generalization, right? Training multiple exemplars of the picture of an apple, and you may say apple in the presence of other apples in the future. That's just, pretty much straight generalization. But when you start to try to build things like arbitrary stimulus classes, so, the picture of an apple, the word apple, maybe the Spanish word for apple, that's when you start thinking about equivalence or derived or emergent relations. It's not the same as stimulus generalization. Well, it's not a completely different principle, but it is a different mechanism. We honestly don't exactly know how it works, but it is something that we've observed for 50 or some odd years in basic, applied, and translational research. In the term equivalence-based instruction, some have argued that it may not be the best term. It's the term that was chosen, just like lots of other linguistic sort of choices in vernacular, particularly in the field of behavior analysis. And it works in a number of ways. I think it's hard to use a term like that to explain all of the different moving parts that result in emergent responding. So things like conditional discrimination training, matched sample training, testing modules, and we'll get into more of that as we go. But the basic is, sort of think about that equivalence triangle that you may have learned in your graduate training, or you may actually have some applied experience putting all of that together. Keep that in the back of your mind when you're hearing some of this. It's hard because this isn't a visual format, so we'll have to rely on everybody just writing all of this stuff down and drawing their own triangles as they're listening. But I think that would be helpful, right? So, having, a class of stimuli that are functionally substitutable for each other. So, like I said, the word apple, the picture of an apple, Spanish word apple, and you can think of literally, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of applications for that basic principle.
So when we're kind of thinking of kind of like you said, Bryan, it's like a magic phenomenon, sort of, we're teaching a few relations and getting a whole bunch more for free. I think we had talked about this sort of in a more, like you're talking about kind of a match to sample sort of fashion. But what I know you've all found and made some great research out of here is, well, what does this mean when we're talking about beyond sort of our like discrete trial methodology? What does it mean when we're talking about speeding up instruction, say at the undergraduate level, or maybe the graduate level? The articles that we have here looking at the graphs or teaching visual analysis of graphs using this technology. So where did the idea for, hey, let's just kind of slap this into a computer come about. It's a technology that's been around since, I think the oldest one cited in the meta-analysis was like 89 was sort of the first time someone kind of put these two, computer technology and equivalence instruction, together.
There were a number of studies. I think, prior review that we didn't include, but if your listeners want to check it out, I think was done by Rayfelt in the early 2000s. I'm getting old, so I'm forgetting my dates here, but it's sometime around then. But yeah, we've always, equivalence researchers and people that have been talking about this for a number of years, we're kind of surprised that it took so long, but, some of it does have to do with technology. What got me thinking about it was, a series of research proposals that I submitted for, like I said, in my doctoral program. And it really got me thinking about, like you said, using maybe not even the equivalence paradigm, but just derived responding emergent relations to think outside the box, right? To teach different skills to possibly college students, right? So the visual analysis article, it's not all that different than my Apple example, but it's just a little bit more complex, right? There are just more things that the learner has to attend to. More, the written stimuli are a little bit longer. There are phrases and sentences. The images may take a little bit more to analyze and attend to, but the basic science, the basic principle is the same. There were 3 stimuli that form an equivalence class. And at the time when I was thinking about it, I can actually tell you that my first round of probe trials were literally printed pieces of paper in sheet protectors that I sat in front of college students with and would rotate them the way you would with more of a simple matched sample. And the college students kind of looked at me like, what's going on here? Right? We can see you rotating. We know what's going on. Just ask me the next question. And I said, okay, I guess that's it for my dissertation. So, pick something else. And at the same time, I was reading some of these articles by Lee Albright and Ken Reeve at Caldwell. And of course, Dan Feenup did a number of studies in this area. And come to find out, they were using, computer technologies, some sort of automated system. So I reached out to Leaf, and he provided me with his system that he was using, that he actually published a couple of articles in JABA on this. And we used that for my dissertation, but it was very cumbersome. It worked really well once you figured out how to program it, but it took me several weekends of, lots of coffee and pizza trying to figure out how to set it up. But once I got it set up, it worked, but there were a number of limitations. And at the end, right at the end of my dissertation, it actually failed, right? So I couldn't access some of my data. Long story short, I was like, wow, now I really have to pick a different dissertation topic. So I quickly cobbled together the final post-test on Google Slides. And I said, well, I think we can do this with things like Google Slides, PowerPoint, that sort of thing. But I took some time because I had just finished my dissertation, thought about it some more. And, a couple of years later, we kept working on this. I had looked at some other applications, things like Quizlet and some other things that we'll probably talk about later. But that's really what sort of set the ball rolling. This idea that this powerful technology is limited by a couple of things. One is availability of computer-based applications. The other is, maybe just people aren't that aware that you can do this quickly with, some available software. So, at the end of my dissertation, it was like, well, we had this program and I no longer have it. I want to keep doing this research. So what do I do now? And I just started exploring and, built on the ideas that others have been doing for a number of years, but just really took it to maybe an extreme, right? I really wanted to make this work, and it does, right? There are still some limitations that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But.
Sure.
Wow, that was a roller coaster of a story. I was like so happy when you said coffee and pizza and staying up all night. I was like, that sounds like not like romantic in like the date sense, but just like romantic in like the sense of like thinking back to like your early days, right? And then you told me that you lost your data and then you had to make a whole new system.
But isn't that how it happens?
Someone should make a movie.
But isn't that how it happens?
It is how it happens.
I think there is actually a Netflix documentary in the works, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Good. They're always looking for content. So
it's going to be called Pizza and Coffee.
Yeah.
So it'll lure everyone in, right? They'll be like, oh, I love pizza. Oh, I love coffee. It hits everyone.
Right.
I was just going to add, I remember, when I was first learning about equivalence-based instruction and using stimulus equivalence with kids with autism, like pre-computer systems and all that. I'm not that old, but I remember using it on a Velcro like board which we would like hold up, and then we'd have the stimuli.
Oh, yes.
And then we had these data sheets that we would counterbalance the stimuli so that every child, the stimuli would be in a different position, just so that we could, incorporate best practice as best as we could. And just like the annoying, like having to look and rotate and then do the trial, and then the kid would respond, and you'd have to do error correction or whatever the necessary consequence was, and then you'd have to like reference the data sheet, read the stimuli, and there was so much personal human error that could occur, and just having to be so like multitasking everything like in the moment versus with the computer system, even though it's pretty annoying having to set it up, at least once it's set up, you can run, and then you don't have to necessarily worry as much about, is it placing the stimuli in the correct order? I mean, assuming you did it correctly up front. But I just remember having to do that myself, and then making sure that I'm actually following the data sheet correctly, running the procedures correctly, implementing the correct consequences, and then obviously making sure your learner is also attending and doing all the things that they're supposed to be doing. So it was a big, for me, moving to a computer system, it was a big, I guess, burden off of me having to worry about 100 things. And I can focus a little bit more on just one or two things and not have to worry about all of that comes along with, doing it by human process versus computer process.
I know for me, I think I tried to set up something that, reading some of your articles, maybe, probably over 10 years ago, where I was like, I'm going to use PowerPoint to put together a really cool stimulus equivalence kind of instruction for students I'm working with. And I think I made about 2 slides, and I said, that took 40 minutes. I don't want to do this anymore. No one's going to use this crazy thing. And I gave up on it.
I just made one of those. I made a self-correcting PowerPoint system.
Well, where were you 10 years ago, Diana? I needed your help then.
I didn't know how to do it then, but now I do. You hyperlink it within the slide.
No, I understand the process of doing it. It took a long time. And like Lesley was saying, I was so worried, like, it's going to go to the wrong thing. I'm just going to spend hours making, a program that isn't actually trying to teach emergent relations. It's just doing the same, like 3 kind of stimuli over and over. It's not going to be randomized, or the kids are going to cheat it, or the technology's, uploading things was sort of, you can just access anything from a phone at that point.
It's really hard to check all those links.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
it's a pain.
And it feels like, if one of these links is broken, forget it. I guess I might as well throw this laptop in the trash, start all over again.
It's so true. And then like a student finds one of the hyperlinks that like, you don't know what
Oh, yeah. Or it goes to the end, or plays a song, or goes to YouTube and plays some sort of inappropriate clip. Like, how'd that even link there? Who knows?
Well, sometimes like in the moment it works, and then when you actually run it, it doesn't work. And you're like,
right.
This. And it did work.
So I guess speaking of my own trials and travails from a decade ago or so, what would be a good kind of online emergent relations instruction program? What would be the components that you'd want to make sure you had in it? What are the types of stimuli you'd want to have in it? And we can speak kind of just generally to start, but I think it'll paint a nice picture for our listeners so that when we talk about your specific examples in your research, they'll kind of be able to visualize it a little bit more, because it is inherently kind of a visual design.
To be honest, I now, even to this day, draw my triangle out because I can't without it.
Yeah, I absolutely still draw the triangle, even when I'm just sort of thinking about things I don't want to research, or we'll talk about an article that Lesley and I it's in print now, but just thinking about real world examples of, how relations derive in our daily lives. So the triangle is a big part of my life. It probably shouldn't be as big a part, but it is sort of always in the background, thinking about how these things relate together. But yeah, for the technological piece, I think, we're going to talk a lot about match to sample and conditional discrimination training. That's not the only way you can train emergent responding. You can, like Lesley mentioned, verbal behavior, there's listener responding, there's a lot of other topographies of learner response, and stimulus topographies as well. But let's stick to the simple sort of match to sample paradigm. Generally, you would want to use best practices for match to sample. We know what those are for early learners, maybe children with autism. There have been a couple of articles that have laid that out pretty nicely, like attending skills, error correction, or even error prevention. Like Diana was saying, randomizing the presentation of trials, making sure the learner, like Robert was saying, doesn't memorize the order of the trials. Those are all best practices for what we're doing here with computer-based training too. I mean, you're just sort of mimicking the physical world with a visual presentation on a computer screen, right? It's not all that different, but there are some, and I don't think we've worked out all of these issues either with things like randomization, that sort of thing. But those are all best practices for the matching piece, right? So you have a sample that's presented, and the learner has to select from an array of 3, that sort of thing. Or even, it could be as many as you want, really, depending on what you're teaching. And immediate feedback, another one, fast-paced trials, all of those things can be replicated in a computer-based format. Now, what gets interesting is some of the research around how to set up those training and testing modules to enhance or to ensure that you have the best outcomes possible. Because one of the advantages of EBI is not only efficacy, but efficiency. And I suppose, you could just train every possible response, right? If you're learning a foreign language, you could just go in every direction, train all of those arrows in that sort of imaginary triangle that we're thinking about right now, rather than just training a couple and then testing. But that would defeat the purpose, right? You're still training all of the relations, but it might take longer. So there are some protocols and structures that lead to better outcomes. And those have been sort of demonstrated in a number of research articles. Again, primarily basic and translational, but we've seen some applied research. Applied research with college students can be kind of challenging because of their histories of exposure and reinforcement, and it can be kind of hard to get really good experimental control. We may even have to shift to, I know, group designs, right? I know we don't want to do that, but we may have to in some ways, because it's just the nature of the research we want to conduct, to compare different types of training structures and protocols. So we can talk about those in greater detail later, but there are a couple identified. It's really not that complicated. Some of the terminology can be a little confusing, and admittedly, it's used probably more inconsistently than it should be, but that's just the nature of science, and we're learning new ways of talking about things. And I think some of those studies, you could pick up, and they may just, you read them and you don't really even understand what's happening. But then, if you can pick apart the things that are necessary for your applied setting, those things aren't really that complicated. It's really kind of a systematic approach that just leads to emergent responding.
I know there were a couple terms in the articles that sort of described what the practice or how you were going to do the setup of your training procedure. So things like simple to complex, linear training structures, one-to-many training structure. And I think you described them very well in the research. However, they're not necessarily terms that, I think that they're terms that are in this specific literature, but they weren't ones that certainly I had a fluency with until I was reading the articles, and they kind of described to me what you were looking at. But what does that look like? Or what do those terms mean in terms of the instruction that you're putting together when you're putting all this work into the technology or online?
Yeah, right. So when you think about the individual relations, or even just the individual responses, so thinking about teaching the picture of apple means the same thing as the word apple, that is a specific conditional discrimination that you can train, and you can train all of those relations in that triangle in a number of ways. You can train them in different orders. You can train them with different what's referred to as nodes. I don't think we need to get into that in too great a detail, but it's basically the terminology of equivalence is somewhat borrowed, if not stolen, from the world of mathematics. And Sidman didn't do it this way, but this is how I learned about equivalence, and I actually made this mistake in my dissertation. We used a linear training protocol where you would train, A to B, and then you would train B to C, and then you would test for transitivity, which would be AC or CA. And that visually makes, a lot of sense, right? If you're just thinking about how those relations and responses go together. But what research has actually shown is that is not the most efficient way. A more efficient way would be to take one of the stimuli in your, let's just say, three stimuli class, right? And use that as, let's say, the node or the one in the one-to-many, and you would teach A to B and A to C instead of doing it in, again, a more linear fashion. Do it maybe, it's not really parallel, but you're teaching that. And you can sort of see if you're following along at home, or if you're drawing these triangles, you can see how maybe logically that makes a little more sense, because you're not having to make as many leaps between stimuli. I'm using very loose non-behavior analytic language here, but that's sort of what we're seeing in the research, right? Again, it's sort of we're seeing data, and we have to induce new theories from some of this data because we don't really know how this works, right? So we're seeing the data and we're learning things as we go. And that would be the training structure. The protocol would be how you group the actual training modules. Well, that's what I refer to them as, maybe trainings. Yeah, I think modules is a good term. So the A to B training would be one of the training modules. The A to C would be another training module, and then You could test for symmetry, which would be B to A and C to A. That would be a test module. And then you would test for equivalence, which would be your CB and BC responses, another module. So when you think about it sort of just as you're preparing or setting this up, you can sort of break these down into, again, training. And that's what we did with our tutorials and a couple of the articles that we've published, conceptualize it as modules. So you can go from, you start training those baseline relations, which are your AB and AC first, and then test for symmetry. And if they fail the symmetry test, let's say, then you could retrain before you go to testing for more complex relations like equivalence. So that's sort of where the simple to complex language comes from. There is another version of that. It's called simultaneous. You can train all of those baseline relations, AB and AC, sort of together, maybe randomly, and then test for all of the derived or emergent relations also together in a separate module without the opportunity to do remedial training. I think there's some, there's some research that supports simple to complex is better, but I think that's an area of research where we probably have to continue exploring. So I don't think that's as firm. I don't think the data are as firm as we would like them to be.
When you're talking about that kind of complex, it's sort of like trial 1 is going to be an AB relation practice, and then trial 2 is going to be a BC relation practice. Is that sort of what you mean by sort of mixing them all together?
Well, not necessarily. So sometimes you may train. So if you have, let's say you have an equivalence class or 3 equivalence classes, right? Let's say it's apple, orange, and pear. What you would probably do for the AB in a simple to complex would be you would train the AB responses for apple, train along with pear and orange, right? So that you have the opportunity to make conditional discrimination. So that would be your first training module, right? So pick 3 fruits and then train them all together. Yeah, maybe randomly present the trials, but that's what that would look like. And then the AC would be maybe the picture of the fruit with the Spanish word. And then you would test for all of those after. So you have to remember, you're not just teaching one stimulus or equivalence class. You're usually teaching at least 3, if not more. I think in my dissertation, I think I taught maybe 5 equivalence classes together at the same time. So you're teaching all of those so that, because you need that, the discrimination, you need to see the different comparison stimuli to know what to choose and what not to select.
Gotcha. A question quickly kind of for Lesley. I know you kind of mentioned this earlier. When you're kind of helping with the setup or you're putting together kind of your trials, I mean, did you find yourself having to just draw out like elaborate, yarn diagrams on the wall to keep everything in mind? Or was it something like the two of you had some kind of just had it in your mind, or you've done enough of these that you sort of are just able to sort of bang these out or kind of bang out with the, where the emergent relations are going to come from, what you need to train first?
It looks like what it looked like. I don't really know, Lesley, but I imagine.
It depends. So it depends on, from your method, I guess, what type of protocol you want to use and what kind of structure you want to use, because that'll dictate how you set up the, which one is going to be the sample versus which ones will be the comparison stimuli. And then from there, you would need to, at least from what I've done, which seems to be at least a good way to have a visual, I usually then make a data sheet, which counterbalances all of that, kind of like what I was talking about with the Velcro board and having to do it. But at least having the data sheet already pre-designed and then using that to set up your computer-based trials and then using it just to kind of do a validity check, like making sure that what you have on your data sheet is actually what you're seeing on the computer screen, and then going from there. But I think it's tough because it's going to vary depending upon, like I said, the structure that you want to use and then the type of training that you're doing. And that will vary, I think, depending upon the research question, and that will vary potentially on whether you're using college students versus children with autism. Like Bryan said, the research is kind of mixed on what is or what seems to be the best. I know for children with autism, I've actually been working on a systematic review with some colleagues, and we've been looking at what seems to be the most effective or efficient protocols and procedures and all those questions that come up when you talk about stimulus equivalence. And the answer seems to be that it's pretty mixed. I mean, there's not really clear, consistent procedures that people use. And so it's really hard to say for sure, like you should always use simple or you should always use, one to many or many to one, because everybody just uses so many different types of structures and procedures and still get, for the most part, good outcomes. So it's really hard to say that it has to be this way or that way. So I think it just is going to come back to what your research question is and somewhat, what you're trying to find out from whether you're doing an applied study or whether you're doing more of a translational or basic demonstration of concepts. So I think that's part of the difficulty at this time.
I always imagine when people are talking about equivalence in derived relations, like a darkly lit room with like one light bulb like splashing up against a huge board, and there's like a ton of Post-it notes with names on them with little yarn stuck across, and there's like different color yarn. It kind of looks like a murder scene, but it's not quite a murder scene.
And it can be so expansive too. Like we've been just talking about a triangle, but I mean, it could be like I don't even know if that would be
really complicated.
Yeah.
5 term, 6 term, 7 term, going to 8 term. Woo!
That's where I get the analysis paralysis. Is I'm sort of thinking about like, I got to min-max this teaching trial. Like if I haven't taught the maximum number or set up an opportunity for the maximum number of kind of emergent relations to come out at the end of this trial, I failed as an individual and I'm not quite sure how to get the most of them. So I sort of stick with my dinky triangle. And then I feel like this is no good dinky triangle. And I move on, which is not a great attitude. That's why I haven't gone anywhere with my PowerPoint.
You can take the next step and maybe make a diamond next time, right? Just add one. Just add one stimulus.
Thank you, Bryan. That's the way to go. I had one step at a time, right?
Baby steps.
Right. Baby steps. So before we get into the research itself, just generally this kind of EBI or this emergent-based instruction, I know there's still so much more research to be done, but what have the overall findings been in terms of have students liked using EBI? Has it seemed to have any superiority to sort of what we think of as a classic instructional format like didactic learning or, read this and I'm going to give you a quiz type of activities?
I think what the research is suggesting is that the efficacy is probably pretty similar. I think there was actually a very recent article, I can't quote it, but it was either JAB or pretty recently where they did some comparison. I think it might have been a group design, I'm not sure. I think what we're finding is the efficacy is probably similar, and that sort of makes sense, right? We've been teaching didactically and with text-based learning and now video-based learning for decades, really. And it works, right? I mean, people pass classes, people learn skills that way, but every learner is going to be very different. And the efficiency is maybe where we can learn a little bit more. The problem is with our research methods, where we've been demonstrating that it works, right? My dissertation, the article that we published a couple of, I guess it was earlier this year, using videos, it was kind of a proof of concept in a way. It's replicating what we already know with new stimuli, new topographies, maybe some different applied questions, that sort of thing. But we're not really stumbling into new ideas. We're just sort of demonstrating that it can work with a number of different learners and different technologies. But I think the one lingering question is it any more efficient than what we are now? I mean, when we think about Zoom learning and that sort of thing, it's different, but it's also still very similar. There's an instructor who is talking, presenting slides, asking questions. There are required readings and study guide questions and quizzes, a very traditional kind of, training or educational setting. Yeah, again, it works, but is it the most efficient? And does it work for all learners? I think, going back to the question you asked about, the social validity of it, I think there's some mixed results there. I definitely have some mixed results in my research that found that some people liked it. Some people even preferred it. Some people didn't care for it all that much. Some people were really frustrated by it. Some people had a hard time navigating, understanding, even where to click. And there were some technological barriers, that sort of thing. So I think we have to be mindful of that. But I think, again, it's the question of efficiency that I keep coming back to, and the fact that every learner is probably going to prefer different things. And, at the end of the day, I think, like Robert was just saying, this idea that you have to create this perfect system to ensure the most learning, right? Yes, I guess as behavior analysts, we want to do the best we can. But, I think of EBI and other authors are kind of coming to this conclusion as maybe a supplemental way of learning, right? So learners who can just memorize a textbook, that's probably not the best thing. But if they can just memorize a textbook and pass a class and that's all they need, great. But if learners need, trial-based learning or multiple exemplars, or they really do like sitting in front of a computer and clicking and matching and watching videos, maybe in addition to attending class or attending a training, they could do that and see if that actually enhances or improves their outcomes. It wouldn't really do much for efficiency, But, it's so these are sort of questions that I think are lingering.
Well, so we've got a nice, I think, summary of what EBI is and is not. And let's take a quick break. But when we come back, I want to get into two of the articles that you shared with us so we can get some even more specific examples out.
I want all the deets.
We're going to come back and get all the deets. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking with Dr. Bryan Blair and Dr. Lesley Shawler about emergent relations and equivalence-based instruction. But before we get back to the conversation, I wanted to make sure that everyone out there knows ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. And by listening to this podcast, you can earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is listen to the podcast and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus. That's GET-CEUS. Or you can, find that fun link on the show page or on the show notes in your podcast player and enter in 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one right now. It's Saluki. Saluki. Saluki, a word you may or may not have ever heard of. I only heard of it because our special guest shared what it was. It is a type of dog, Saluki. Okay, I'll spell it again because, again, not necessarily the most familiar word to me. Saluki. Saluki. All right, let's get back to our discussion. When we last left off last week on emergent relations, we were discussing more generally what this type of instruction looks like and how it could lead to emergent relations. Now we're going to get into some actual specific examples on how equivalence-based instruction could work. And I'd love to start with your article looking at the visual analysis of graphs. I think of the two, I feel that one was sort of just a nice, starter. Like, this is generally what it looks like. And it's a skill that if you're reading this, you probably can do yourself. So it made a lot of sense. I think the follow-up did as well, but sort of was looking at some different components, some more advanced components of EBI. So where did that article come from? The idea of the visual analysis of graphs. Why graphs? Why EBI? Just for fun? Just looking at graphs?
Yeah, loads of fun. Well, it's interesting. For a number of years, I've sort of been aware that visual analysis is a skill that maybe even, I struggle with, we all struggle with. We pride ourselves as behavior analysts as being the visual analyzers, however you verbify that. But, we look at single subject data, we look at baseline and in transitions to intervention, where we should be good at that. But there's a number of articles and research that has shown that we're generally not as good as we would like to be. So it's sort of, I'm like, well, that's an area that we could consider. And I mean, this is bringing back some interesting memories. I proposed this to Lesley in a class, and we went back and forth. And to this day, I'm not sure if this was all her idea because it was my dissertation. I ended up being the first author, but either one of us probably could have taken this. And, you were asking about how you draw those triangles. I remember pretty vividly, I think it was a Google Doc. I don't think because we weren't in the same room, we were doing things remotely, but I think we had a Google Doc or a Google slide shared, and we were drawing the triangles. And it took me, probably 2 or 3 weeks to figure out, how we would actually do this. And, come to find out, I probably didn't do it as well as I could have. I probably could have, even conceptualized it a little bit better. But, we picked the equivalence classes, the different types of functional relations that could be identified with, an AB type of graph, a reversal or withdrawal design. And we used a number of those graphs. We just created a number of just mock graphs as multiple exemplars, and those were our visual stimuli. And we had the definition of different types of functional relations established by graphs. And you can think about what those graphs could look like. You could have a clear functional relation. You can have one that's a little less clear, and then one that's a clear no functional relation. So there's different levels of functional relation that could be established. And we just broke those up into equivalence classes and used match to sample training. It was like I said, it was a computer-based program. We invited participants who wanted to learn more about visual analysis. Many of them were undergrads, but they were interested in applied behavior analysis or going into the field and just wanted to learn about it. And they came to the basement of one of the there was a lab at Endicott College at the time, and we just ran some sessions. Most were single sessions, so they would show up, they would just click and match and take a break and do some more clicking and matching. And they would learn the skill.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And that may be why the social validity isn't quite as high. We might need to think about how to make this a little bit more interesting.
A brighter room, Brian. Less basement trials, I think.
But that was the basic. That was the idea, right? And they learned it, and I watched in real time as they were learning, and it was a fascinating sort of experience for me as a new-ish kind of researcher in this field, seeing them test and seeing their test scores, seeing some of the remedial training that was required, and just I couldn't really analyze it because I don't know enough about the participants, but it was just interesting to see different participants respond in different ways. And by the time we were done, we had, I don't know the total number of participants, 8 or 9. Well, we probably had 25 that went through. We had some that didn't work for. We had a number of pilot participants where we were trying to really, fix the system, and there were some glitches and that sort of thing. But when we finally did it, it was probably, I think, 9 total participants, and we had some good results by the end of it.
I was trying to remember the context specifically, but we had some like ABAI in-person pilot interactions. Do you remember that?
Yeah, right. So we were trying. Well, I knew that visual analysis was an issue, right? Prior research, people have actually done systematic investigations into whether or not we can, visually analyze as well as we think we can. But for my study, I wanted to see if the graphs I was using would actually be socially valid, right? Were they valid graphs? Could we actually use them for our study? So at one ABAI, this was back in 2016, maybe 20. I don't remember when. I do remember Chicago, right? It was right where we had the posters and stuff, and we just had volunteers come up, and we would ask them to identify, the level of functional relation, and we used that data to determine whether or not these were actual identifiable graphs. So a lot of them were highly skilled behavior analysts. We also had PhD behavior analysts look at them and make sure that they were okay to be used for the study. So the results that we got were that much more valid because we had that pre-training check on the stimuli.
Actually joking about that recently because I remember Bryan was already there and he was like emailing or texting me like, bring the graphs. So I had to print out like 200 pages of graphs. And we were like, why did we do that? Why didn't we just have it on like a computer screen? So I forget.
Yeah, it was just one of those things like, well, that was just the way things were done, right? You had printed stimuli and it made sense to do it that. Yeah, I might actually still have some of those data sheets that we use.
So I like showed up with like this huge stack of paper in my suitcase, and I was like, here are the graphs.
Yeah.
I love that.
So in terms of what was being taught, the graphs themselves used like rule statements about like, this shows a change in the level, this shows a change in the trend. And then a functional relation statement, right? So, there's a functional relation, there's not a functional relation, there's kind of maybe a functional relation. I don't think those are the exact technical terms, but something along those lines, correct? And
it was probable and probable functional relation, probably not.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Which was, I know, probably upsetting for you that the language could not be parallel there, but you got as close as you could.
Yes. Yeah. Well, what was even a little more upsetting was just the idea that we had to break it. I mean, because we know that visual analysis is just like this infinite number of classes, but we had to, pick 5, and it made sense. And actually, my dissertation advisor at the time, Dr. Michael Dorsey, probably gave me the most feedback. He's like, I just can't believe you're breaking up, functional relation statements into these 5 arbitrary categories. But like, Rob was just saying, they were arbitrary to an extent, but they were rule-based, right? So we had statements about level and stability and trend and all of that built into, and it was about I don't know, 15 or 20 words. It wasn't a whole paragraph, maybe one or two sentences. I'd have to actually look at the stimuli now. And they would match, right? They would be presented with a graph. I don't remember the number of graphs we had, but we had numerous because we used multiple exemplar training. So we had a lot of graphs that they would match the graph to either the statement or the label, right? Like functional relation, no functional relation. And then we would test for all of the different possible emergent responses without directly training all of them. So they would form these equivalence classes consisting of a graph, a rule statement, and a term, right? So all of the different levels had one equivalence class with, well, multiple visuals, but.
And I mean, the results looked great. I mean, you had 3 of the 4 participants did exceedingly well in terms of, I think it took less than 30 minutes for them to, have the relations all emerge in terms of their post test. Then later you did generalization. Again, 3 of them were able to maintain the skills at a pretty good rate, given that this was, kind of a new way of teaching this skill in this regard. So, I mean, were you happy overall with the results, or were there sort of pieces? Actually, you already mentioned, Bryan, that there were some pieces that you feel could have been better. Could have done it better, right?
Yeah. So, going back and looking at that, the first round was a slightly different research design, and we got some interesting feedback on that. We don't necessarily need to go into that too much, but we were using a pre-test, post-test design, which has some limitations with experimental control. So, the data that actually got published was the 4 participants where we shifted to a multiple baseline. Now, not a traditional multiple baseline. You can criticize that research design to a certain extent too, and that's probably for another podcast. But, we did see some pretty profound, and what I think is pretty interesting is immediate, right? So we would do the pretest, maybe a second pretest, don't see a ton of learning, which you wouldn't expect to see anyways. And then, like you said, you do some training, and during our pilot study, maybe the way we had it set up, or maybe some of the phrasing of some of the stimuli that we edited over time led to less efficient. But we did see some very immediate emergence of those derived relations for 3 out of the 4 participants, right? One of them did require some remedial training. One of the things would be maybe looking at the actual structure, the linear piece to it. We may have even gotten more efficient responding. Maybe using fewer equivalence classes might be, and again, this isn't really a clinical thing. It's more of I want to get my dissertation done, so I want to show really good experimental control kind of things. But we're also replicating other research, and we're that's how science is, right? We're just going to change a couple of things. So maybe we could have used fewer classes, but it's what we went with, and maybe it might have been easier for the learner to respond. But you're right. 30 minutes isn't too bad.
No. You even had a comparison, I think, with the generalization data that you did later after the maintenance, and the students, or at least the participants of the study, did as well with kind of the basic analysis of graphs as a number of BCBAs. I think they did a little bit better than some BCBAs you asked to do the same. I'm going to be careful. If you ever ask me to look at a graph and tell me what I think, I think I should.
Well, and some of them were, some of the ones on the edges, right? The clear and the no functional relation were easier to identify, but some of them, there were overlapping data points and that sort of thing. And you're right. It was interesting to see that. I can't remember who the BCBA participants were. That's probably actually a good thing. But they didn't. Some of them didn't respond as well as we would like them to, and some of that could be the immediacy. But we did some maintenance tests a couple of weeks later, and we did find and that's another area where I think a lot of researchers and even clinicians and instructors probably find this to be an issue for whatever reason, and it could be because of how quick the training is. 30 minutes of training may not result in great maintenance over time. Who knows, right? There are a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One thing I love, Bryan, and I love a good flow chart. The flow chart in this article is on point. Just want to say, it's always my favorite flow chart.
Mm-hmm.
The only way I can think, right? Again, I wouldn't have been able to do it yet. Leif Albright tried to hold my hand and walk me through it. I said, no, I have to draw my own chart because I just can't follow what you're saying, similar to maybe what some of the listeners are going through right now. But I encourage all of you to break out that flow chart and think about how you would do it. Because that's, that's the definition of systematic instruction. We need these steps. We need to know when to retrain. We need to know when to step in and maybe change how we're actually doing some of the instruction. So that was priceless for me. I needed that because I would have never been able to do it without it.
Yeah, and it's so helpful too, because you're like, if you pass, you go here. If you fail, you go here. So I think it's such a streamlined flowchart, and I love myself flowcharts. So I just loved this one.
So kind of moving on and continuing on in this realm, I mean, at least the next article we'll be talking about looked not just at the individual, visual stimuli. You guys bumped up to videos, video content. Lesley, was it kind of like Bryan was describing before? You guys were chatting it out and you're like, let's move on to videos. Or how did this kind of genesis of switching from the static stimuli to these complex visual and audio stimuli, how did that come about?
I'm trying to remember. That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly what prompted the conversation, but I know when we were looking into it, we were both very surprised that there hadn't been previous studies that had used videos really within stimulus equivalence. There was one lab that I think they had 3 studies that they taught sign language using video models, so like mimetic responding. And then they did use that, but they did not have any auditory audio in their samples. So it was just a person that was like showing the sign, and then they did some TAC training within the equivalence instruction. So we were actually very surprised that nobody had previously looked at using videos within equivalence-based instruction. And so our study was a little bit different in that we had both the actual video, but then we also had audio to go along with that so that people could actually, hear what people were saying and follow along in that realm. I don't know, Bryan, if you remember exactly what prompted that whole discussion, but I do remember us being surprised that nobody had done it because they're so prevalent nowadays.
I think some of it came from the article that we replicated, the O'Neill study, where they did talk about didactic, and it wasn't really lecture-based, but I think the participants in that study just read some PowerPoint slides or read the chapter on verbal behavior. And we went back and forth and we said, and I don't know, chicken and egg, I'm not really sure what idea came first, but it dawned on us that, a verbal behavior episode isn't really a static thing, right? You have a speaker, you have a listener, you have things that the learner, the person observing the episode who's trying to learn about verbal behavior terminology, they need to attend to lots of different things. So actually, before we even recorded the videos, we thought we were going to make little comics, right, with little speech bubbles, or
I love that.
Yeah, well, we may still do that, and that may actually end up being more efficient. Who knows? Or an audio only, where we were just going to record 2 people having a conversation with no video. And I think we said either one of those would be fine. But then, Lesley was able to do some studio recording and hired a couple of professional actors. No, I really don't know, but it came out pretty good. Well, I'll let Lesley talk about that a little bit. But it added some complexity to the actual research. But I think it was invaluable to the question we were asking, and extending what others have done from static stimuli to these, moving parts. Now, at the end of the day, we don't really know what the learners, the participants in our study were actually attending to. But again, we got some pretty decent, interesting results.
I kind of love the idea of trying to teach verbal operants to one's students and be like, I'm going to show you some pictures and tell me the operant. It's just a bunch of pictures of people holding out their hand and opening their mouth. Like, right. Which operant is that one? Which one's this one? Go back to the drawing board with that one. I don't know if they're going to pick it up that way. So maybe videos. Yeah.
How hard was it to decide what was going to be in the video?
Hard. Well, yeah. It was not so much deciding what was actually going to be, but getting some good validity, right? So Lesley and we actually had a handful of other, again, BCBAs, PhD level, I think, watch the videos and determine if it was clear. Because there were some videos that we saw and we're like, oh, that's clearly attacked. And then everybody else watched and we're like, that could be an intraverbal. Who's the speaker? Yeah. Who's the listener? There might be some mand going on there too. We had maybe 50 videos, 45 videos that we started with. And I think we ended up with 15. We had to cut a bunch because after looking at them, it just wasn't clear enough that we thought that a learner could actually discriminate one video from the next.
So were you scripting those out, or were you just telling your actors, actresses, okay, just talk for 10 minutes and we'll go from there?
I think I basically said, we're going to do some examples of mands or tax or whatever it was. And then I kind of had to, so I used some therapists at the agency that I was at when I recorded these and had to bribe them with some free dinner. So they were kind of willing to participate, but not willing. So, I mean, they were graduate students. So, I mean, they had, at least some knowledge of the different verbal operants, but I kind of had to feed them like, okay, we're going to do some examples of mands. And so, I'd kind of let them kind of figure it out for a minute. But if they needed help, I'd be like, okay, well, why don't we just do this? And then, whatever was in the room, I'd be like, oh, look, there's a bag of cookies. Why don't you just ask her for some cookies or whatever was in the room? So I kind of scripted it on the fly because we didn't really come into it with a script, but it was just whatever was available and accessible in that moment. And so to me, like Bryan was saying, like I would be like, oh, that's very clearly a man. But then, when you kind of take a step back and you actually watch it, I could see like, oh yeah, I guess it could be attacked or that could be this. Or, verbal behavior often is multiply controlled. So sometimes not that clear. I think that in the end, it was good that we did so many videos because we were able to just cut out all the ones that were kind of unclear, multiply controlled or whatever.
I think that lends itself and explains why the video would be so important because they're, verbal operants makes such great sense when you're looking at the, a little chart describing, what's the listener doing and what's the speaker doing. And then when you're saying, okay, here's people talking, go, what do you see there? There is that sense of subtlety. And well, this could be an impure man, I get, which of these operants could it be? And certainly having that experience with somewhat, not exactly tightly scripted, but, generally we're going to do some of these operants now. I think that makes sense as to why the video would be a great format for actually teaching the skill to, what you want, which is I want to teach people verbal operants so they can make clinical decisions based on their ability to, identify which operants are occurring or not occurring in the actual environment.
Yeah, and we ended up so we had some generalization videos, which was with completely different people. So it was a mom and her daughter that were still contrived, but we actually did some generalization videos that were purely just like, okay, you guys play for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it was. It was like all sorts of different verbal operants all mixed in, just like a normal play interaction. They'd be playing and the daughter would ask for something and then she'd be like, oh, look, it's blue, or, just all sorts of different operants occurring all over the place. And Bryan and I, were coding it so that we would have like a basic like answer key of like, okay, this is how many attacks, how many mans, etc. And it was pretty difficult. We were having a time because it was just so natural that we were like, well, was that a man or was that attacked? Or, it was very, it was just normal interaction. It was hard to gauge that.
I think we did second by second video analysis of the 3 generalization videos. We went like frame by frame, not quite, but we would watch like 3 or 4 seconds, pause and say, what did you see? So, the generalization data wasn't stellar, right? But it was relative to what other people would do in a similar situation without this type of training. So BCBAs who went through, a more traditional didactic type of training and verbal behavior scored similarly on that generalization probe. So it was hard, right? It was a fast-paced, people moving around the room and trying to take data on the number of operants. But I think it was a really good real-world example of what could happen when you just use emergent-based training techniques. And, if what you want the actual therapist or you want the BCBA to do with that skill after they learn it. And I think that it was a decent test of that.
And the overall protocol was, at least it certainly seemed to me much more advanced in terms of the procedure you were asking the individuals or the participants to follow through. They had to type answers. It wasn't just, click the screen and it was progressing forward. Could you talk a little bit more about the kind of additions that you put into your protocol? And I guess the other kind of second question there, was this sort of where your idea of using free software came about? Or had you already sort of started thinking about how could we make this type of learning free or easy for other individuals to use?
Yeah, I think my thinking around this obviously has evolved. And I think it started with my tragic experience with my dissertation that just failed. And it left a sort of a sting. And I said, I don't want this to be the case ever again. So we have to use accessible applications as much as possible. They have to be free. You need to be able to use them on different computers. So a lot of that did influence what I wanted to do. Now, I sort of forced square pegs into round holes to make it work for this particular piece of research, but it's definitely applicable outside of that experiment. But yeah, so I had to think about, it's the immediate feedback that is one of the challenges. One, I think it was Rob or Diana mentioned earlier, how you program PowerPoint to do this sort of automated thing. It's not easy. Maybe it's a little bit easier now, but 2 years ago when I was designing this, because it takes forever to get things out and published, this was almost probably 2 years ago that we did this. We had to think of some way to give feedback. So I came up with an idea of using some really simple formulas in Google Sheets so that whenever they typed the letter of the response, they just got immediate feedback, right? So they were told if it was correct or not.
That's so clever.
Yeah.
It took some pilot things. I had to use like multiple screens. And it took some learner training. I'm actually thinking back now. I think I had watched YouTube clips of cats and dogs so they could practice, identifying a cat and a dog and just typing DOG to make sure they understood how it worked. But after the first, 5 minutes, it was fine. Very few technological or technical glitches. The internet went out a couple of times, but it worked pretty reliably. And I still have those videos and those matching slides, and I use them in my verbal behavior courses that I teach. I don't necessarily use the answer input because that would be harder in a didactic, but I could easily throw that up on a website or something, and somebody could do it. So that was my workaround for that automated feedback. The question I keep coming back to with all of this is, why aren't people outside of behavior analysis cashing in on this? I think this would be something that lots of ed tech people just know how to do with some simple programming skills. But I don't have those skills, or I don't have them right now. I maybe could take a year off and try to figure it out, but I don't know if I want to do that. And there's programmers that could do it in a weekend, I think. So yeah, there was some sort of I sort of made things work for the research. They're not 100% applicable, but they would work in a real world setting. And then we used a learning management system called Canvas to just do the testing, right? Because Canvas does a pretty decent job of presenting videos. I think the reason why we used Canvas was that was one of the only ones at the time, put a video as a question, right? Or even videos as answers, because I had to figure out how to use the videos as stimuli. It wasn't just an image. And I think there were some limitations with other pieces of software where you couldn't use videos as the stimuli.
I want to move into Dissemination Station, which is sort of where we start the wrap up of the episode, which is a little odd because we still have one more article to talk about. But I do feel like that article itself really does answer so many of those questions of what's next for EBI, which I think was the purpose of, one of the purposes at least of writing that article. So why don't we do that? We'll move into Dissemination Station, and then we'll talk about your, I guess not most recent article, but your BAP article that's a tutorial on how you at home can make your own kind of EBIs using, free off-the-shelf parts.
So I'm going to do my big reveal.
So you've been, studying EBI. You've had successful implementations of EBI. And Bryan, you kind of already mentioned it. Like, how come nobody's doing anything with this? Because I know, I'm sure all of us are listening saying, wow, technology that allows me to teach all these free extra relations that I don't even have to say a word about. This is amazing. And there's just not a lot out there. Like, no one seems to have capitalized and created the multi-million-dollar EBI platform. I mean, I'm guessing from some of the findings in your tutorial, were you surprised that one of the limitations was the technology is not cheap, or it is programmed in a way that the average person is just going to not even bother, given this the time of day?
Yeah, I think, I was definitely surprised by the cost of some of those. I won't name names. They're named in the article, but some name brand sort of off the shelf things that are used in ed tech and online learning are ridiculously expensive. I'm sure for good reason. Probably takes a lot of time to develop that software, but it's not really feasible for a BCBA. Maybe they own their own company. They're trying to train a bunch of staff to go and buy $1,000 program to do it. And on top of that, it'll take you several weeks to set it up. So it's just not that feasible. I think that's one of the two of the reasons, right? Cost and accessibility to the actual, even these off-the-shelf programs require some minimal sort of technological programming skill, right? You need to be able to sort of navigate all of, like you mentioned earlier, hyperlinks and all of that. So now the feature set is great. I mean, you can do a lot with those applications, but it can be a little challenging. Those are a couple of the issues. Another issue too, I think, is hopefully what this podcast is helping a little bit with is just sort of the accessibility to EBI as a technology, not as a computer-based technology, but just as an ABA technology. And a lot of the research that's been published, it's readable, right? You can definitely understand if you spend some time with it. And I'm guilty of this as well. It can be a little challenging. But some of it, wasn't you couldn't play around with it, right? You couldn't take this program that so and so published and take it home with you and spend a weekend with it and do something clinically and have it run on Monday morning with some of your students or whatever. And I think that was another limitation. So being able to use and practice some of the things that you're reading in the research is an essential part of behavior analysis that I felt was a limitation. So the point of the tutorial was to try to meet many or to answer some of those problems. The tutorial is very limited in its own right. I mean, there are lots of things that it can't do, but it proposes a free fully accessible across any operating system using Google applications. Hopefully the explanations in the tutorial help people understand the technology of EBI. Again, not the computer technology, but the behavior analytic technology, so that they can extend some of that research to real world problems or do their own research.
And sort of what were the components that you were looking for in addition to sort of being free and easy to use that you thought were going to be relevant for further work in EBI, whether it's through research or just through putting together more kind of robust, training packages? Were there things the software just had to do or they were no good to you?
Yes and no. I think simplicity was part of it, a minimalist kind of thing, because again, without naming names, but there are some Office applications out there that can be a little intimidating with all of the options and the things that you can do and lots of drop-down menus and all of that. And I felt that Google provided a maybe overly simplistic, overly minimal experience, but it allowed, I think, the tutorial to be delivered in such a way where there wasn't a lot of extra stuff, right? There are definitely limitations, right? A lot of the automation can't be done the way you can do it in something like PowerPoint. But without the automation, you're not worried about that, right? You're just focusing on the simplicity of putting a sample on the screen and creating a couple of hyperlinks. You're not worried too much about broken hyperlinks, because if it's broken, you can find it pretty quickly because it's a very simple presentation. And the web-based piece, I don't think I mentioned that, but the fact that you could collaborate. So Diana could be creating her own set of slides to be used for an EBI program, and she could say, "Hey, Jackie, could you help me with this? I'm not finished." And Jackie could, without having to send files back and forth, you could be in the file together. That's just a Google thing. That's a collaboration thing. I think Microsoft is doing a better job recently, but that was what Google was really good at 4 or 5 years ago. And I said, that's really essential. And now with telehealth, right, that adds another layer where people are remote and, just being in the document together and creating your own little EBI modules, I think was really critical. And some of the other applications just didn't. And, like I said earlier, many of them were only either Windows or only Mac OS, maybe Windows and Mac, but not Chrome. They didn't look very good on iPads. Some of the stuff I proposed in the tutorial would look great on a phone or on an iPad. It would just work the way it looked on a computer.
It was interesting, too, because I don't remember exactly the timeline, but this article came out maybe a few months right around the time that the pandemic started. And it seemed like, immediately after, like in March, April, May-ish or so, like, Bryan is the corresponding author, but he would be emailing me or telling me like, oh, people are interested in the article. And I think, the timing was good in that, people were like, okay, now I need to use some kind of system that I can do online because I can't, have face-to-face interactions anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Be interested in trying to develop some way to use equivalence-based instruction, probably, with children with autism, or I don't know exactly the context that they were using it in, but it seemed like it was kind of perfect timing as far as when it was finally published, and then the necessity of needing a method that didn't require having to sit in the room with the individual, just given that we were social distancing and all that kind of stuff too.
And I mean, I know certainly kind of reading through the article and then going online and getting the supplementary material, which is the actual detailed tutorial itself. It is a really great way to sort of break down the steps and what you're doing. Certainly if you haven't read any of the other EBI instruction, I think it would be very confusing as to not necessarily to then, use the tutorial, but what am I doing with this tutorial? So I think it was helpful that I read this. I think I read this article first, then I came back and read it again because I was like, what is it I'm reading here? I'm going to make this great PowerPoint, or I'm going to make this great Google Sheets and Google Slides. And why am I doing that? And then, having the context, it certainly all fit together very nicely. It was kind of a fun computer design exercise.
Is it bad that I still have like a mental block about Google Slides?
I do too sometimes.
They get so mad. Anytime I put anything online and it's Google Slides, it's like, well, I'm downloading this to PowerPoint as soon as it's done, and we're switching this out of now.
I don't like being limited.
It's the collaborate, like Bryan was saying, that collaboration is we can all collaborate on one document, and it's not like sending the file back. I added 10 slides on the wrong one.
That is truly the worst. Yeah, no, I get it.
The Google applications, like I said, on mobile devices work really well. Again, nothing's perfect, but it works really well. I don't know about Microsoft or even Apple. What are they called there? Apple Keynote, right? Yeah. I don't know how those look on mobile. They probably look pretty good on iOS devices, but this is a universal thing. Even on a very low-powered Chrome computer that a lot of people are using in educational settings, you can just fire it up and go to the Google Slides and it should look just the way it does on any other computer, which is sort of essential to this because part of this is the visual presentation. We want that to be very consistent. We want those hyperlinks to work all the time. We want the stimuli to always be sized correctly. So that's part of it.
If someone sends me something in like Mac Numbers or Mac Keynote, I send it back. Nope, no, try again. Use a different program.
Well, even like the program that I used for my dissertation, so it only works on a PC, which I don't have a PC, I have Macs. So that was the first problem. So I had to buy like this tiny little computer for my dissertation. And then the program itself, I had to try to get people to save on flash drives and mail me the flash drive. Mm-hmm. It was in California and I wasn't there. That didn't work. So then I ultimately ended up flying out to California and like literally had to like download it onto my computer so that I could use the same program that they were already familiar with. And I think it was probably about the time that we were starting to talk about needing a more easily accessible platform.
Yeah. There used to be in the Shriver Center, there were these very old laptops and you had to use them in order to run I don't know if it was an equivalence program, Jackie. Was that right?
There was one that you had to use.
Yeah. And they were ancient laptops, but it was the only thing that it would run on because it was built specifically to run on those things.
It might be the same program. I don't know.
Yeah, it was equivalence. And then they did some stuff with resistance to extinction.
Yeah.
Beautiful though.
Which was mine and Jackie's master's
thesis, the little sprite. Remember
the little sprite? Yeah.
Anyway.
So sorry.
It was old. It felt like lugging around like the nuclear football.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just, if we want this to be something that people use, that just can't be the way we do it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like that's a huge barrier. Operating systems, carrying around a computer. Yeah, maybe people argue that you need to be connected to the internet. That could be a barrier, but I think the internet is so available these days that that's not as much of a barrier as maybe it was even 5 years ago.
I agree, Bryan. You're not going to get anyone. Here's a new technology. It's going to take, some time to get used to it. And you have to understand, basic stimulus equivalence. And you have to use this very special proprietary software that costs a ton of money. And it's going to take you a semester to figure out how to use it. But after you do all that, I'm sure boom, you're going to get the door slammed in your face. I don't think people have whether it's the wherewithal or the interest to get over that, the barrier there. Talk about response effort to something new.
And even with apps like Duolingo and like Rosetta Stone and stuff like that, people are essentially doing, stimulus equivalence type procedures, not necessarily knowing that that's what they're doing, but, and you can do it while you're, standing in line, waiting for, whatever you're waiting for. And it's very little response effort. And I think you can adopt the same type of things, for whatever teaching topic you want to teach. As far as I know, I don't think anyone's developed any apps or anything specifically related to like behavior analysis specifically. I don't know. You guys are aware of any?
I don't know.
No.
I haven't seen anything.
No.
The children's educational programming on apps is no good.
It's the worst.
It's so not good. They provide all these extra like color-based cues in any type of like what's basically MTS in there. Or the no sound will be like way, way more fun than the correct sound. So they need to get some BCBAs in there.
Yeah. Well, we sent some letters to Rosetta Stone and Duolingo and even Quizlet, right? So Quizlet's an option, and you're probably not surprised that our letters were not replied to. Nobody really had much of an interest, but we offered, hey, let's do some research, right? This is what we're seeing. This is called, stimulus equivalence, emergent responding. The Quizlet people are, I'm generalizing here, I don't know them personally, but I think their research is a little bit more along the lines of like memory-based type of conceptualization. So more mainstream psychology and long-term versus short-term memory, as opposed to discrete trial and map sample and emergent responding. But I do think that we could help them even improve their products, but they just don't see it the way we are proposing it, or they just have a valuable product that they see no reason for making any changes to.
Yeah, that certainly could be. Well, I guess that brings us to kind of ending questions of what's next in terms of, EBI research for the both of you. And in general, where would you like to see this line of research going in the next few years? What are the big questions that are still out there waiting to be answered?
I think for me, thinking about more complex stimulus response relations, different topographies. We've talked a lot about selection-based responding, but I think there's a whole world related to listener responding and tacting and and identification of categories, that sort of thing, that I think that's going to take another leap in the technology, because we're going to have to respond to the different topography of the trials. I think that's one. I think, again, coming back to the efficiency question, is it even worth it, right? There was a study not that long ago, well, it might have been, now it's probably 5 or 6 years, but did something where they compared training just the limited number of responses that we've been talking about the last hour or so to just train everything, right? Why not just train everything? We're talking about typically developing learners. They can learn pretty quickly. And I think we need to be honest and see if you see, similar durations of time that result in the same results, then even though this is, as Rob said, sort of a magical thing, and it's sort of inexplicable in a sense, if we don't need to do it, then we don't need to do it, right? So let's be scientist practitioners and follow the data where it leads. That's one thing. So the efficiency. Thinking, again, complex behavior. So Lesley and I actually just recently, I think it's in Press, where we looked at how different sort of unexpected behaviors might arise. So we looked at the hoarding type of behavior that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're like, I wonder if that has something to do with this derived relational responding, and was that directly trained, and et cetera, et cetera. And we proposed a model for the possibility, right? So this could be a reason for why people were stocking up on toilet paper when there was literally no need to do that. And I think maybe we could use this computer-based technology to reverse some of that sort of incorrect rule following, and those might be derived rules. We're not really sure what they are. And maybe even, apply it to things like cultural biases. I actually have a chapter coming out soon. We looked at that idea, could you sort of retrain people systematically to identify and to sort of reverse cultural biases with a type of emergent responding training where you don't teach every possible relation, but you do teach a couple and see, and then test for, are those cultural biases still there? Are people still saying, I'm going to stock up on toilet paper? Are there things that you can do? And it could be computer-based, right? We could just put a couple of modules online and say, if you're interested, just click through and match a bunch of stuff and, answer some questions, and we'll see if something derives.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it does.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say something that I didn't really refer to it by name, but we've kind of alluded to it a lot. So I've been really interested in the transfer of function that occurs typically when equivalence classes, maybe not always, but sometimes they form. And so there's a lot of really interesting research that is in both the applied and the basic research. It's very interesting if you look at things like when working with children or individuals with autism, just some of the things that you can demonstrate. So just like as a couple examples, I know Kaio and some of his students, have done some cool studies teaching like piano skills to both typical children and children with autism, where they taught them, music notes. And then in the end, after they formed equivalence classes, they were able to actually play music using those same notes like on the keyboard. So stuff like that I've been very interested in, stuff where you can teach them, like words and pictures are interchangeable, and then they can respond to the pictures just as they would, or I'm sorry, to the words just as they would to the pictures, and vice versa. So stuff like that I've been very interested in, and wanting to be able to use, transfer function in a lot of different ways, but specifically going back to, talking about individuals with disabilities, because I think that we could really capitalize on teaching them a lot of really functional and appropriate skills by doing that. So I think, moving forward, that's an area that I'm definitely interested in, whether it's, computer-based or tabletop. Sometimes with kids with autism, there's a lot of prerequisite skills that come into using computer-based instruction with them. There's been examples using both computer and tabletop presentations, but I'm definitely interested in exploring that a little bit more and wanting to see, how we can teach them different applied skills and just help them to be more, adaptive in whatever ways. So that's definitely an area that I would like to explore and do some more research in moving forward.
So, Bryan and Lesley, thank you so much for sharing this line of research and for kind of going into some of the fun nitty-gritty details of putting it all together. If listeners are inspired to look at the tutorial and kind of put together their own EBI programs, or like me, to be re-inspired to finally, figure it out, noodle around, now that there's a nice tutorial that tells me exactly what to do, it's a little bit more efficient. Is there a way that they could get in touch with you if they, they run into any, technical questions, or if they have any kind of ideas or thoughts they want to, they'd like your opinions on? Is there a way that they could reach out to you?
I'm going to plead the fifth. Can I just know that's fine? Yeah, anybody can definitely contact me. You just send me an email at bryanblairbcba@gmail.com. Bryan with a Y. You can also I think there's probably contact information on some of those articles if you don't write that down when you hear it, but I'm happy to send materials. I have some sort of works in progress and Google slide templates that I've been meaning to post. There's a YouTube video that I've been meaning to record. I will say that there are a number of other people in this field doing similar things. So there are other people that have recorded YouTube videos that have put up some other templates. So there are other things out there. I can't name them by name at the moment, but there are some people, not like hundreds, right? This isn't functional analysis research, but there are a handful of people that are trying to help, because we do know that just making that step, right, creating that first Google Slides file could be the barrier. So we're trying to provide some templates to share.
That's nice.
And you can contact me, but I'll probably just refer you to Bryan. But answer any questions. But if you need like resources and stuff, Bryan's the one that is good about making all that kind of stuff. So I'd probably tell you to contact him.
And that just creates an infinite loop because my email is forwarded to Lesley, so I don't know what's going on.
And then I'll say,
we're like, we can't get a hold of anyone.
But I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks once again to Dr. Bryan J. Blair and Dr. Lesley Shawler for coming on the show to talk about emergent relations and equivalence-based instruction. We had a great time, and we hope you did too. If you liked the show, we'd love it if you subscribed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. There are a couple other ways you can reach out to us as well. You can certainly go to the website, abainsidetrack.com, find links to all of the articles that we've discussed, and to purchase CEs for the majority of our episodes. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram as ABA Inside Track. And if you'd like more Inside Track content, why not join us on Patreon at patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe for just $5 a month to get access to our bi-monthly social meetups. If you'd like to subscribe at a higher level, the $10 level, you can also get access to our extra long 2+ hour book club podcast that we do about once every 3 months or so. And those are worth 2 learning CEs each. So it's a great way to learn all about a book that maybe you don't have enough time reading. And again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And of course, you can always email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. And finally, for those of you who are interested in those aforementioned CEs, you probably want to get our second secret code word. And it is seagull. 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 The bird that flies near the beaches. You've all seen a seagull, right? If you haven't, that's okay. They're kind of annoying pests. One time, Diane and I went on a picnic and they destroyed the whole box of Cheez-Its that we had. It's our own fault. We probably shouldn't have left them open. Seagull. And with that, thank you again to our special guests. Thanks to Jackie and Diana. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.